Good afternoon, and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, the place where you're in the know. Today's program is Food Fight, the battle to bring healthy food to the state's poorest, and is sponsored by the California Wellness Foundation. You can find the Commonwealth Club online at commonwealthclub.org. I'm Jason Mark, the co-manager of Alamany Farm here in San Francisco and the editor of Earth Island Journal. It's my pleasure to introduce a really fantastic group of guests today to discuss this really important issue. Dana Harvey is the executive director of Mandela Marketplace and has spent the last decade in the nonprofit sector working for food security, education, and economic development. Ken Hecht is the executive director of the California Food Policy Advocates and has been involved in several private and nonprofit efforts to address hunger and food security over the course of several decades. And then, finally, Sue Sigler is the executive director of the California Association of Food Banks, which looks to maximize the state's food bank's ability to build a well-nourished California. So I think, as all of you know, San Francisco and the San Francisco Bay Area are synonymous with good food and with nutrition. This is, famously the birthplace of Alice Waters' Delicious Revolution. It's the epicenter of, and the birthplace also of the organic industry. And there's a really high consciousness about wellness and nutrition. And yet there are still tens of thousands of people here in the region who suffer from hunger. Every week, the San Francisco and Alameda food banks alone serve at least, I think, 70,000 people. And beyond that, there are many thousands of households here in the region that are food insecure. And at the same time, we've got vast food deserts, places where there are very little access to fresh, small caps whole foods and nutritious foods, places like East Oakland or West Oakland or the Bayview, Hunters Point District here in San Francisco, where the only options are fast food, processed foods, which are contributing to an epidemic of obesity, diabetes, heart diseases, and are leaving us with a generation that's going to be less healthy than their parents. And so I think the question is, how is it possible, how is it conceivable that there's these two separate worlds that are sort of on top of each other? And I guess the first question is, what are you doing and what are your organizations doing to bridge that gap, again, in a region that's got so much wealth and for many people has got plenty of access to good, healthy foods, and yet for so many other people, it's not affordable and it's not accessible. I'd love to hear what you guys are doing to address these issues.
Dana, you want to take a shot?
Sure. I just want to say one of the other important institutions that deal with food access is the Alamany Farmers Market. So congratulations on that. It's an affordable farmers market that is highly successful. So what we're doing to bridge this gap, we are looking at a multidimensional approach at bringing access to food, but also looking at how do we begin to get to the root causes of why a community was food insecure in the first place, and looked at what are all of the different sectors that need to link together in order to create a comprehensive and a holistic answer to that question. So Mandela Marketplace, a nonprofit, incorporated in order to help some residents open their own community-owned grocery store in a community that has had no grocery store since 2006. And made a commitment to bringing in very healthy food. Well, through the community process, the residents also wanted to make sure that we linked to minority farmers and under-resourced farmers as well, who face similar challenges as do inner-city residents in terms of lack of access to resources. So we also have built long-time relationships with local farmers and are building wholesale markets for farmers who primarily sell at farmers markets. And thirdly, how do we then take the opportunity of having the wholesale food plus this grocery market in order to bring healthier product mixes to other corner markets within the neighborhood? And this is primarily in West Oakland, where about 40% of the residents do not drive. So it's really critical and important, and I think it's one of the models of an inner city community, period, in order to have access to your basic needs by walking. And so how do we really work with our corner markets to help them improve their product mix for the community? So, really looking at this as a replicable model and understanding how do we catalyze a local food economy and a local food system.
Ken or Sue?
I'm really pleased to be able to say that California food banks have been doing cutting-edge work for the last decade in terms of helping low-income communities, and particularly food deserts, be able to access healthier foods. And one of the primary ways that we do that is through a program we call Farm to Family. We work with growers and packers from around California to obtain fresh produce, fruits and vegetables that are what are called, depending on the market, cull products or B grade, what is just below supermarket grade, so that when you walk into a supermarket, you know that everything there is perfect and uniform, and not everything comes out of the field in that manner. And so, and our food banks have had to go a long way to sort of retool operations from distributing shelf-stable food to be able to handle fresh produce, to be able to distribute it rapidly. And now we have food banks that, many of our food banks are distributing well over 50% of the total amount of food that they provide in fresh fruits and vegetables. And the Farm to Family program will distribute over 115 million pounds of fresh fruits and vegetables to food banks this year, and who will then in turn distribute those to people who are in need. And that's of particular importance as we focus on not only getting adequate food out to the members of our communities, but also to taking those foods to places where there isn't access. We all know, I think, about food deserts and where places where fresh foods can't be had at any price. There simply aren't retail outlets to serve those communities. And so that's one of the strategies that food banks use to help impact low-income folks with a healthier diet.
There are two parts to the problem of unhealthy diets. One, which Dana talked about so well, has to do with access, being able to get to good food. The other part of that problem is affordability. Do you have the money with which to purchase the food in the first place, or do you have other resources with which to get healthy food? And that's the portion that I would like to address for a moment. A very wise person said, hunger is a political decision. And I think that has never been truer than it is today, when the Super Committee in Washington is dealing with a farm bill which contains the food stamp, now nationally known as SNAP, now in California known as CalFresh program, is housed. And there's no question but that this primary resource for low-income people is going to get chopped in Washington, and we need to do everything we can to moderate that chopping. The country for decades has had a bipartisan support for the CalFresh program, food stamp program. It is enormous. There are currently in California 3.8 million people, that's 1 in every 7 people in the state, on the SNAP program. The beauty of the program is it's counter-cyclical, so that before the recession, exactly 5 years ago, half that number of people were on food stamps. Today it's doubled. What that means is that people can get the resources they need to buy food when they are in desperate times. People cycle on, cycle off that program. No one wants to be on it, but many, many people need it. And that program is in great jeopardy today.
So Ken, I'd really like to follow up on that, because this is important news. Some of you guys might have seen the article in today's San Francisco Chronicle. There's also been a lot of writing on different websites like Civil Eats and Grist about this. But the Congressional Super Committee, which is supposed to be coming up with a multi-year plan to deal with the nation's debt, is I believe there's only something like 12 members of Congress on the whole super committee, is in effect writing the Farm Bill, which was supposed to be a more drawn-out process throughout the course of 2012, in which a lot of food justice and activists and advocates and organic farmers and all sorts of different stakeholders would have had time to to offer some input on this important piece of legislation, which actually is in effect for 5 years. So I'm wondering if you could, or Dana or Sue, anybody who's working on this, what is the danger and what can folks actually do right now to respond to this, and what are your concerns, again, of this farm bill being written in secret?
Let me take a whack at that. What's happening is, exactly as you say, there's a farm bill, which is a huge piece of legislation being written in secret. No one has the foggiest idea what's going to be in there, although we do have a pretty good idea of who's doing the lobbying. What's going to come out of that bill is going to affect the food stamp program, SNAP program, but it's also going to affect what's grown in this country for the next 4 to 5 years, and that is not going to be good for healthy foods. So we need to do something, and you asked what can people do. By the time you leave this program, there will be a link on my website, California Food Policy Advocates. It's www.cfpa.net. Just for Commonwealth Club people who have come to this lecture or hear it on the air, and it will lead you through making a phone call to your congressperson now while the phone call counts, while these deliberations are going on. They're going to be over in a couple weeks, so it's now or never really. But if you'll go to our website, you'll get all the help you need on calling your congressman and letting him know what's important to you.
And Dana and Sue, is this something that, how does the Farm Bill affect the work that you're doing? And is it something you're following and are lobbying around as well?
Absolutely. It affects food banks' work dramatically. What we've seen in the food bank world since the advent of the recession is, prior to that, people turned to food banks for the type of services that we were designed to provide, which is emergency and supplemental food to help a family get through a month when there just aren't quite enough resources to go around. And prior to the recession, we saw families looking for 3 to 5 days worth of supplemental food every month. Today, we see families looking for 14 to 17 days worth of food from food banks. We're not prepared to be able to provide that. And what we hear out of Washington constantly is that if we cut programs, the food banks will make up the difference. And we are right now experiencing a perfect storm. And what I mean by that is that we are seeing less food flowing to food banks than we did over the last several years for a couple of reasons. One of those is that many donors turned their attention to safety net services during the recession as they saw their friends and family members in need. But donor fatigue happens over time, and so food banks are seeing fewer cash contributions that allow us to purchase food at very low cost. The second is that we rely also on federal commodities programs, and we're hearing talk about cuts there, not only perhaps in the amount of funding for food purchase, but also food banks receive money for handling and transportation. So it makes sense that if we need to be able to distribute food, we also need to be able to pay for ways to do that. In addition, the USDA runs a program in the commodities program what's commonly called bonus buys. And what that means is that when there are certain agricultural markets in need of support, prices might be dropping in a way that would be devastating to those farmers. The USDA comes in and makes buys of that food that then becomes available through the commodities program for food banks. Food prices have remained very, very strong, and so the USDA has not been able to enact any bonus, or very few bonus buys in the last year, and that diminishes the flow of food to food banks as well. And then lastly, food banks received additional funding to help cope with the recession through the Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and that was greatly helpful, but those funds have sunset, and so food banks experience that as a cut. So what we see are cuts coming from every different direction, and in addition, when we look at the other types of federal assistance programs that are being cut for low-income families, what we often cite is that those cuts all land in the same household. So that if your health care is cut, if your food funding is cut, if your unemployment runs out, if there are other programs, home health care is cut that you rely on in order to get through, and they're all cut across the board, that doesn't get spread equally among the population. It tends to land in the same household with devastating effects.
Can I add 2 footnotes to what Sue just said? One had to do with the bonus commodities that she was talking about, that food banks aren't getting anymore. Schools aren't getting those either. Mm-hmm. And federal commodities of the right kind. Now, I don't mean the big commodity crops, but the foods that kids want to eat at school. Just a foundation for families that are in trouble to be able to know that their kids are getting half or more of their nutrition a day at school, and that it's good, healthy food. That food has now been diminished by the loss of the bonus commodities at the very time that we're looking to school meals to do an even better job. And I want to underline what Sue said also about the role of the food banks. No one ever imagined when the food banks started that they were going to be a prime source of food day in, day out for low-income people in this country. It was supposed to be emergency food. It's now chronic food, and they don't have the resources to deal with that. So if the federal programs are shrunk by the super committee this week or next, part of it's going to fall right in the lap of the food banks.
Dana, is this something that you're looking at and could affect your work possibly?
It does affect our work, primarily when you're looking at the distribution of funds in the Farm Bill and who is accessing the support and the subsidies. Agribusiness farmers and genetic modified crops are a real threat to a diversity in our food choices. Smaller farmers who are really looking at organic practices and rely on a lot of the support funding from USDA that has incredible programs to support small farmers. There could be a real challenge for us in having a diverse food system. I would say, though, on the flip side of that, in the work that we do, in particular in a very low-income community, the population we work with, systems tend not to work for us anyway. So when big systems shifts happen, it's a threat and it's a challenge, but we are very used to being resilient and creating our own sort of local dynamic survival network. So it is very important, and it does impact us as all policies do, but at the same time, there really is this drive and movement to understand how do we become stronger on a very much more local level so that these major national shifts or global shifts aren't at least impacting our basic needs.
And I want to come back to the work you guys are doing at the grassroots and sort of creating an economic model that really is independent of government and need to be reliant on government policies, even though you're affected by them. But while we're on the policy question, I know that there's been, even as there's concern about what's happening at the federal level, there's been some real important reforms that have happened at the state level this fall. A couple of bills that Governor Brown, that passed the legislature, which Governor Brown signed. I'm wondering if you could tell us about them and how they've created real improvements in the CalFresh program.
I thought you'd never ask. We had just wonderful success at California Food Policy Advocates with 2 bills this year, and I could tell you for the hour all about them. One is AB 6, which finally removed finger imaging as a requirement, fingerprinting as a requirement to apply for food stamps. Yeah. An extraordinary deterrent to applications. Every member of the household, adult member, had to be fingerprinted, even if only one citizen child was eligible for food stamps. Right. So it was an extraordinary deterrent both to immigrants and to other people who have jobs. Most people on food stamps these days work. And for them to get off of work, be able to go to the food stamp office to have their finger printed was not a good picture. Mm-hmm. Secondly, participants in the food
and I would imagine also a deterrent to undocumented households.
Absolutely.
With citizen children who were eligible. Absolutely. Secondly, the reporting period for participants in food stamps was lengthened from 3 months to 6 months. Often people inadvertently fall off the program because they're not clear on what their reporting requirements are, and this helps to diminish that problem. And thirdly, it will provide a much greater benefit for people who have to have high heating or cooling expenses during the month. There'll be a heating benefit that helps people get a better food stamp benefit each month. The other bill, which we are thrilled about, is our first foray into senior nutrition. Only 5% of the seniors who are enrolled in Social Security and are eligible for food stamps receive them. And what we have done is to set up a system by which the information that people give to the Social Security agency will, if they consent to it, be transferred over to the CalFresh office, and people will find it much easier to enroll for food stamps for which they are eligible. So we are thrilled that we're getting started at bringing these benefits to seniors who are not doing well in terms of nutrition.
I think there's also the health in all policies. Were you working on that as well,
We were. Go
Ken?
ahead.
So I'm not as intimately familiar with it as you probably are, but there is a statewide policy to integrate health in all state policies, and food was sort of a major component of that. One of the suggestions was that the state of California do all of its food purchasing from local farmers. So we'll see how that plays out. But
Another bill I should have mentioned, and then I'll stop on the bills, is there was a bill that was signed that establishes a human right to water. You say to yourself, in California, why do we need that? Well, as it turned out, half of the schools in California didn't provide free water to kids when they were having meals at school. The same lack of water in childcare. Those problems have now been addressed in California and nationally. And there's legislation that requires schools, requires child care centers and homes to make sure that kids have access to free water while they're having their meals. We're just thrilled with that. There are good things that are happening, but there's some ominous clouds in Washington.
And I want to add also, while we're talking about bills, just how terribly exciting it was to see the governor sign these bills, and one that the Food Bank Association sponsored as well, that created a tax credit for farmers who donate fresh produce to food banks. So there's, as of January 1 of this year, farmers can receive in a tax credit 10% of the wholesale value of what they donate to food banks. And that's important because many people are aware that much of what is grown in our country never makes it to market. Some estimates range as high as 50% of what's grown. It doesn't come out of the field because there's no market for it or because it's not profitable. And sometimes sometimes farmers have to cut their losses and say, if I may have spent what I spent to grow it, but the real cost is in the harvesting, packing, and transporting it. And so oftentimes we know that there is food in the field, and that those few pennies a pound can make the difference for a farmer to be able to say, okay, I don't take a loss if I pull that excess out of the field and give it to food banks. And so, but I did mention those. The governor took those bills that Ken just mentioned and this one and signed them together as a package. And it was just a great day in California. Many of those initiatives, particularly the elimination of finger imaging, groups like Ken's and others have been working on for more than a decade to see that eliminated. And over the last couple of years, we're able to introduce those, get them passed through both houses of Congress, or both houses of our state legislature, only to have them vetoed in the governor's office, which was terribly disappointing. And estimates are that the CalFresh participation would increase as much as 7% with the elimination of finger imaging. So we hope we'll be able to see far more people in California with access to adequate food as a result.
That's fantastic. I mean, I think it's really amazing to think that, you know, today 50% of, at least by weight, 50% of the stuff that's in the warehouses and goes to the clients at California food banks is fresh fruits and vegetables. And I'm curious to know, just because it's such a break, I think, from what many of us sort of imagine food banks as, you know, the canned green beans and you know, again, lots of that was had a very long shelf life. And so I'm wondering, what was the response from the client families that you serve? And also, were there any challenges with that? I mean, challenges around maybe even kitchen literacy, maybe people who was not accustomed perhaps to cooking with fresh fruits and vegetables, or other challenges of even just how do you move this stuff through the warehouse and the amount of time you need, and how do you maintain a cold chain and stuff like this?
Sure. As you can imagine, the response from families in need has just been heartwarming and dramatic. Some of the best anecdotes that I hear come across my desk are when we hear about children who are getting fresh fruits and vegetables in their diets for the first time and come back and say, Mom, this is great. Can we please have this at home? Many food banks are also operating what's called backpack programs. Ken mentioned earlier that one of the primary sources for many children is school meals. Well, what happens on the weekends? And if you ask any school nurse, they'll tell you that they see an unusual number of headaches and stomach aches on Monday morning, and they are from children who did not get enough to eat over the weekend. And so many food banks are operating what's called backpack programs, where young people are given a package of food to take home over the weekend, and often that includes, as a primary source, fresh fruits and vegetables. I'm aware of a food bank that recently did a survey in a high school to find out would teens be too ashamed to take a package package of food home over the weekend, and indeed they found no, that program became a very rapid success. And when they asked teens what was the one thing, what were the things they wanted to see most in that food package, they said fresh fruit. They just simply don't get it. And so it's very exciting to be able to see that demand. And but to answer more of your question, Jason, yes, what we see often is folks have not had wide exposure to a different variety of types of crops and food products, so that they need not only to put a zucchini in somebody's hands is a wonderful thing, but if they don't know how to handle it, store it, prepare it, then it may not be used properly. And so food banks also access funds through the SNAP program federally for nutrition education, and we are able to marry that on the ground by putting fresh produce in someone's hands along with the nutrition education that they need to understand why it's important to incorporate it in the diet, how to prepare it, how to store it. And we see food banks doing that in some really remarkably creative ways. We even have food banks that are doing street theater with folks who are waiting online. We know that giving someone a recipe and some instructions is better than nothing, but it's really a hands-on or experiential learning experience that really provokes behavior change in a family.
I got to give you one great anecdote. The schools are working in the same way that the food banks are on improving diets for the kids who go there. And Los Angeles Unified is just doing a dynamite job. They've thrown out all their fast food items, and they're serving real food. And yesterday they decided to take pieces of jicama out into the elementary schools and give them to kids. And apparently the kids just loved them. I was just amazed. I was about 60 before I had my first piece of jicama, but these little guys were getting them and loving them. One of them said, this tastes much better than what I get at McDonald's. Must have confused the jicama with a French fry. But anyway, it was a big success. And anyone tells you if you feed kids real food, they won't like it. That is absolutely wrong, and we've proved it over and over and over again, as has Sue and has Dana. You give people good food, and they love it.
You know, listening to the excitement about folks being really enthusiastic for fresh and fresh produce and fresh fruits and vegetables leads me to this one question from somebody in the audience. Dana, I'd love you to respond to. It says, why do food deserts exist if there's local demand? I guess the question being, if there was really a demand, wouldn't the market, I suppose, in an ideal world, come and fill it? It does make me think about, I've heard people point out the fact that in Oakland, for example, one of the most impoverished zip codes is the Chinatown zip code, which also has one of the highest percentage and densities of greengrocers. So what is your answer to that? I mean, why do food deserts exist if there's a demand, or is there not the demand there? What are you seeing at the Mandela Marketplace?
Well, there is a phenomenon of sort of inner city demise with the coming in of urban renewal projects. And in West Oakland, as an example, there was an intentional disinvestment from that community. So as urban renewal projects came in and the businesses moved out of the community, or actually were bulldozed out of the community to make way for housing projects, banks actually intentionally drew red lines, that's where the term redlining comes from, around the community and said, we will not invest in this community. So the taking out of local business and then having sort of a local tax base move out without any reinvestment into building an economy in the community sort of leaves people in a disparate situation in terms of access to economy and resources. So that's sort of the context. And then what happens is, we do have a lot of small markets. There's about 48 corner stores in West Oakland, but they primarily sell liquor, cigarettes, paraphernalia, et cetera, and a lot of candy, snack foods, junk foods, et cetera. So they can call themselves small grocery stores because they do have a bag of rice, a can of beans, in the store. So interestingly, West Oakland is not under USDA guidelines considered to be a food desert because there's so many corner markets that are labeled as small grocery. The USDA recognizes sort of that code. So this is the situation that happens, and then you're in a community of people that are really lack resources. They're either shopping at their corner stores, or they're traveling a very long ways to go to a Pack and Save or to grocery outlet or another sort of supermarket. So that's what sets up the system. So it's not that they can't get to food. It's that there really isn't a healthy, local, thriving access point for them that also, gives them the benefit of, earning the money to buy the food that they want. And they're not getting invested in. The people themselves are not getting invested in to change their condition or to open their own businesses. So they're a little bit, beholden to those forces.
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead, Sue.
I think it's also important to remember, I think most of us, our minds leap to food deserts being in urban areas, but it's important to remember the rural areas as well, where, yes, you may have a demand, but there isn't a critical mass of population to be able to support a retail outlet profitably. And where people have to travel vast distances in order to be able to find a retail outlet for groceries.
And I would add that there's also a bad reputation in inner city communities that people don't want to eat healthy, fresh food. So the major grocery stores think that there's no market for them in these communities. So they don't want to come in and open a store because they just figure no one's going to buy their food. And thank you, it's true, rural areas. And in fact, I think Fresno has one of the highest rates of hunger among farm workers, and it's one of our, breadbasket agricultural centers. So that's interesting as well.
Fresno County currently is one of the top 2 unemployment rates in the country, and at times topping 40% unemployment in those communities. Yeah. They had the double whammy of the drought and the recession that happened there and devastated the agricultural communities. And so it is one of the great ironies of being in California that that the people who help grow the most food often have the least access to it.
But if you look in the New York Times today, you'll find that this problem is not confined to rural areas by a long shot. There are urban areas, including some in the Bay Area, which are now escalating into what the government calls severe poverty areas, in which 40% or more of the people are in poverty. So it is a problem that we have here in the Bay Area as well as in the rest of California. And the thing I wanted to add to what Dana and Sue have been saying is in part, they're talking about some of the causes and some of the consequences of obesity, which we haven't really addressed yet this morning at all. There is a hunger problem, and it's a serious one, a persistent one, and as one of the politicians said this morning, a malignant one. But at the same time, obesity and overweight is a very serious problem which is costing our country lots of money and people lots of their lives. And the obesity and overweight, in large part, is stemming from a lack of access, lack of affordability to the same foods that we've been talking about all day, the foods that we need for good health and to prevent both obesity and hunger.
You're listening to the Commonwealth Club of California radio program, and today we are hosting Food Fight, the battle to bring healthy food to the state's poorest. I'm Jason Mark, editor of Earth Island Journal and co-manager of Alamany Farm in San Francisco. I'm joined by Dana Harvey, executive director of the Mandela Marketplace, Ken Hecht, executive director of the California Food Policy Advocates, and Sue Sigler, executive director of the California Association of Food Banks. Sue, I'm really glad you brought up the situation in Fresno County, because I think it points to kind of one of the enduring Gordian knots of issues around food security and also creating local food economies. I know that Mandela Marketplace has got a real commitment to supporting local farmers, which is, we have this idea that food should be healthy, that healthy food should be accessible to everybody regardless of race, ethnicity, geography, income. And yet at the same time, we want to have that same sort of social justice for farmers and growers. We've got farm workers here in California who are getting food stamps. More than 10% of farming families live below the poverty line. And so do you guys have any ideas on actually how you balance the needs to perhaps pay farmers and growers more, but if we did that, that would perhaps then increase the cost of food, which would make it less accessible? How do you manage those tensions?
I hate to go first on a question
Go
like
ahead.
that. Well, as I was mentioning to you before the program, our building is at 14th and Broadway in Oakland. We're at the epicenter of Occupy Oakland. And I am at least preoccupied by the inequality that sees people who are working hard to grow food unable to purchase it. Fresno County, one of our most impoverished, one of our most hungry, and one of our most obese and overweight, all together. And the counties that border it, Kern, Tulare, even worse. We have not done well in spreading out the benefits and burdens in this country, and where the jobs are, the way the taxes are levied or not levied, and we do really need to deal with those things in order to make it possible for people to work in the fields and eat healthy diets.
I think that one of the things that's interesting, if you look at some of the other states that have recently enacted restrictions on immigration or taken other actions that have caused some farm workers to flee, with the assumption that we can just substitute that with other unemployed people, and it's not working. And so we really have to reaffirm a value for the folks that come and help us grow food in the fields. And I heard a really interesting remark from our former Secretary of Agriculture here in California, A.G. Kawamura, a couple of years ago, who said, come on out and watch people in the field working with machetes to cut broccoli and how fast they go, and they don't cut off their limbs, and stop and think about whether you think that's unskilled labor or not.
Mm-hmm. I would say a couple of, so one of the ways that we're trying to balance that is by intentionally creating wholesale markets for small farmers. Many of the farmers that we buy directly from in order to supply produce to Mandela Foods Cooperative sell at 7 or 8 farmers markets a week. So that means they're maybe sleeping 3 hours a night, and they do not have, and they're making a very subsistence living. So really finding a way, a better mechanism to keep the farmers on the farm more. And so we're trying, it's a pilot, to pick the food up directly from the farm and bring it into the city. And we're doing some analysis now to see how can we do that in a cost-effective way so that we don't have to underpay the farmer. The other thing is, in that strategy, we're really bringing it direct from farm to retail. So we're cutting out sort of a middleman, and our farmers are getting about 40 cents on a dollar. And I think nationally they're getting something like 5 cents on a dollar. I would say a couple of other issues around just our farmers, and this is also tied to the Farm Bill, is if farmers are allowed to really farm with a more organic principles, so a sense of community and stewardship of the earth and farming in a healthy way, rather than a very, this is a large tract of monocropped fields, and your job is to get as much out of it as you can, as fast as you can, because that's the bottom dollar. That sets up a very different strategy around farming and a different approach to farming. And that cheats the farm workers. But if you've got more of a community sense and the farmers are working more in a community and have these direct relationships to their markets, then it does open up as having our local grocery store. It's almost catalyzing sort of a local farm economy as well. So it catalyzes a different approach and keeps more dollars in the farmers' pockets.
We have a few projects that are going in school districts around the state where school districts are coming together to purchase from farmers who are coming together. And those places are called food hubs, and they can be anything from just a place where food can be deposited and picked up, or they can be a place where food is actually cooked or prepared to be cooked, as well as delivered to school districts. So it's an opportunity to take small farms and small school districts and give them the volume that they need to make it economically feasible.
I'd say there's also strategies around helping to create value-added infrastructure for farmers. So one of our farmers, she makes really good salsa, but she doesn't have access to a commercial kitchen to make that salsa very frequently. So we get it from her maybe once every other month. But if we were able to help her have better access to a certified commercial kitchen, she could use a lot of her waste products and actually generate a new income stream from that. So there's other strategies that can be put into place, so it's not this direct, well, I want cheap food, and so I'm not going to pay the farmer for it. I will say also, consumers will pay a little more because they, we had a woman, she always went to the 99-cent store to get her bell pepper every day. One day they didn't have it, so she came to our store and bought a bell pepper, and she said, I will never buy produce from 99-cent only again, because she tasted the difference in something that was grown in a healthy way and picked ripe. So we actually got a customer that way, at least for our produce. And she's willing to pay a little more for that pepper because she can really taste the difference.
Fundamentally, it comes down to valuing food is something that we should put more value on than, say, some of the other stuff that we buy and sell. A question here from the audience. This questioner says that EBT cards in San Francisco can be used in places like Burger King, and is this a good use of tax dollars? I think this gets back to what Ken was talking about. It's not just affordability. It's not just accessibility. It's affordability in what we're eating. The questioner says, if the issue is to provide healthy food, are programs in San Francisco in place to provide healthy, ready-to-eat meals directly to low-income people, perhaps upscale soup kitchens or Meals on Wheels type operations?
There is a very small program called the Restaurant Meals Program that's part of Food Stamps or SNAP or CalFresh, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. It was designed a couple decades ago for people who couldn't use food stamps. They didn't have a place to store food or to cook food, or they had some disability which prevented them from doing one of those things. And so for a tiny part of the population, the ability to take the food stamp card, the EBT card, to a restaurant nearby means that they can get some value out of the program. Otherwise, they really couldn't at all. But it should be kept as small as possible because you give up a lot of money quickly for the food that you purchase. So we've never wanted to see that program be any larger than it had to be to serve the few people who couldn't use the benefits any other way.
Might be interesting to just kind of strategically place them. So next to every McDonald's is a, small, healthier food truck option.
And to the question, is that a good use of taxpayer dollars? I mean, would it be fair? Does it make sense to say you can't? I mean, obviously you can't use EBT cards to buy alcohol or tobacco. Mm-hmm. Would it make sense to say you can't buy some foods, or is that that going to shut people out?
I think you hit on a really important question, which is choice. And that's been a relatively hot topic in some food circles fairly recently. We've seen some attempts on legislators' parts to limit choice. And we at the California Association of Food Banks believe that it would be a mistake to limit choice for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a slippery slope. If we start going to Washington and saying, it's okay to buy this product, but it's not okay to buy that product, I personally believe that pretty soon we would have, a great deal of lobbying influence there, determining what products, could you purchase a Frito but not a Dorito? I don't know. The second is, and the second thing is that there was an organization that did a study not too long ago that saw that low-income people make identical food choices to people with adequate resources to provide for their own food needs. And so what we really believe is the issue is national education, and to leave anyone with the impression that low-income people are making different food choices from the rest of us would be really a disservice.
Let me offer a friendly amendment to what Sue just said. There is a pilot program being tested in Massachusetts now, the germ of which came out of California Food Policy Advocates some years ago, to test out incentives. And what's happening in Massachusetts is if someone who uses a SNAP card purchases fresh fruits or vegetables, that person gets a little bit of money put back on the card. Mm-hmm. And the question is whether that incentive will be enough to encourage people to use their food stamps to purchase healthy food. We think it will be. The pilot program is testing this incentive at various levels. How much do you have to give back to make it worthwhile to someone to make those purchases? But as Sue says, there's no reason to believe that low-income people won't purchase exactly the same foods that everybody else will if they have the resources with which to do so.
You know, Sue, in an email you sent me earlier this week, you were talking about how important and influential the Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign has been. And a questioner asks, you know, how are we or how should we encourage health through popular culture? Can we develop partnerships with iconic figures to support wellness? You know, how do you make good food cool? And it sort of reminded me, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's a school garden educator in Santa Barbara, and he was saying, you know, how do we get like the sports figures? You know, how do you get LeBron James to stop, you know, shilling for McDonald's, instead get LeBron James to maybe shill for the, you know, growers cooperative ocean spray? I mean, I don't know, but what's it going to take to really sort of move the zeitgeist a little bit more?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One is, I think, you know, you cited something that, you know, there was a brilliant marketing strategy where we've been able to convince every child in the country that every time they play soccer, they need a sports drink. So, yeah, marketing is enormously influential. One of the things that I am most excited about right now is Sesame Street is putting an emphasis on teaching good nutrition in very simple ways that even preschoolers can understand. When I look at this and say, if preschoolers can understand this, surely adults can too. And it's about how to make food choices, looking at foods that you include in your diet more frequently and less frequently. And I really believe that that it is possible to change eating habits in the course of only 5 or 6 years as each child graduates through those preschool years, and I'm very hopeful in that regard. Other than that, I think having that leadership in the White House to say that this needs to be a national priority is also very exciting.
After you have gone to cfpa.net and called your congressman to tell him to save the SNAP program, go to Michelle Obama's website, which is Let's Move. It's fabulous. And she's using some of the Sesame Street icons as well. I was there yesterday looking at suggestions that she makes on that website for people who operate childcare. I don't know if you know this, but by the time a child comes to kindergarten age, 1 out of 5 of those kids is already obese or overweight. Mm-hmm. And once that happens, it is very hard to reverse it. So that is a critical age to look at. So she has very easy suggestions for people who are running childcare. Promote water. Don't permit sugar-sweetened beverages, which knocks out chocolate milk, which is sort of ubiquitous at school these days. Limit the amount of juice, which is often just sort of liquid sugar, and make sure that the milk is low-fat or non-fat. Those are not costly ideas or costly changes, but they can make an enormous amount of difference day after day after day for a child who's in child care every work day of the week.
And I would just say it's going to really take a retooling of how we see our society, not just around food, but just really around the influence of corporate media. And you know, whoever these big players are, you know, definitely instead of buying a Burger King, you know, invest in the local community to make, you know, Mary and Joe's sandwich and soup shop, you know. So there really we have to step back and remember to really believe in ourselves and our own talents and skills, and not feel like we need to rely on major corporations to come in and fill our needs. So I think there really has to be sort of this shift happening, and I don't know how to reach those, you know, those players or famous people. I think Magic Johnson was supposed to come to Oakland to promote his 24-hour fitness, and there was a protest or something that just happened, so he had to reschedule for another time. So sadly, we missed that one.
You know, what you were just talking about now, Dana, gets to another question we've got here from the audience, which is, you know, how is resolving the issues of access and affordability, how is that connected to really an industrial food system here in the United States? Obviously, there's been a sweeping wave of concentration on the producer side, at least since the early 1970s, and Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, when he said "get big or get out," and since then we've seen a massive concentration, especially in the meat industry, but also commodity soy and corn. and how, if at all, does a more industrialized food system also then impact these issues of accessibility and affordability? And I guess on the flip side then, how would conversely a more of a local, regional, sustainable food system perhaps provide some solutions?
Well, I would say, protesting Monsanto is not going to help. So our approach is really to build something that is strong, that's going to outcompete them. And I went to the Sustainable Food Summit last year in San Francisco, and I was very excited to see farms like Organic Valley Farm and Strauss Family Creamery investing time, energy, money, strategies in order to create a complete sustainable farming system and create a very healthy product. But on the end of that, so they're really working hard. Our producers are working hard. At the end of that, who do they have to sell to was the question, and Walmart. So I really feel like there is this imbalance, and we have to create the businesses that the sustainable growers can sell to. So there is a serious problem with the industrialized food system on many levels. I mean, it's a petroleum-based farming system, which causes a lot of problems for us just around, oil and petroleum. It's also pesticide-based, which causes a lot of problems with sustainability of the earth. So there's sort of that whole environmental piece. And we just need to outcompete them. We really need to grow and invest, and mindful people need to really think about that and begin to invest in strategies so that they will either change or they will go away. We'll get small or go.
Ken or Sue, any ideas on that question?
Pass.
We got a pass.
I think it's enormously complex, and it depends on where you touch the food system. I think that we've just passed 7 billion people. We have a lot of people to feed, and I would love to see us being able to do that worldwide for things that were sustainable and local and culturally appropriate. It's a pretty big problem to solve. However, there are enormous economic implications, and so yeah, it's a big one to tackle. And I think as we live here in the Bay Area, we're very blessed with a year-round growing season, and not everyone has that. That's another huge issue as well.
Yeah, it's really embarrassing sometimes to be at a meeting in Minnesota in the winter and say, "Oh, I just had strawberries," So so it is. We are really lucky to be in California because we do have access to really good food all the time.
Well, an audience question here that might be a little bit easier, which is how do kids that get federally subsidized school meals, what happens to them during the summer times when school's out?
Always a problem. There are programs that are supposed to operate during the summer, but they are attached to other programs. Tell you what I mean. Many kids formerly went to summer school. They had to, they wanted to, it was fun. They had an opportunity to learn some more and to be with their friends. As budgets have collapsed in California, many of those summer school programs have been closed. And with the closing of those schools, there's not only an academic gap that has grown, but there's a nutrition gap that has grown. When children are out of school during the summertime, they don't have access to those school meals that they normally did when there was summer school. There are other programs designed to help that gap also. The Summer Food Service Program is one, but it's a complicated, difficult program, and again, it needs to be attached to something, to a park and rec site where there's some activity that will draw the child in addition to just getting the nutrition. So I think the short answer is it's a serious issue. I don't think it's been solved. USDA is working on it. There's some pilot programs going on around the country to see whether simply adding to someone's SNAP benefits per month is a better way to add nutrition to the family during the summer for the child who normally would have got a free or reduced price meal at school. But I don't think there are easy answers to this one either.
And I do know that at least here in San Francisco, the city continues the school district continues to do subsidized lunch program distribution in public housing complexes when school's not in session, so that reaches at least some people.
I think they get something like 72 cents per student, is that right, for the lunch? Do you know what the dollar amount is that's allocated for the summer free lunch program?
Yeah, it's about the same, or a little bit more than the summer, than the regular school
So it's
meal program.
$1.30 or something? It's
Yeah,
a really small amount
it's
of
very
money.
small.
I mean, we've tried putting together alternative lunches for students, but to do it on $1 a student was a real challenge.
Yeah.
Once again, you're listening to the Commonwealth Club of California radio program, and today we're hosting Food Fight, the battle to bring healthy food to the state's poorest. I'm Jason Mark, editor of Earth Island Journal and co-manager of San Francisco's Alameda Farm, joined by Dana Harvey, executive director of Mandela Marketplace, Ken Hecht, executive director of the California Food Policy Advocates, and Sue Siegler, executive director of the California Association of Food Banks. We've just got a couple more minutes. But one question I want to ask you, Dana, because I think the work that you're doing to sort of create just an economic alternative. I mean, a business grounded in the community that's addressing issues both of affordability and access. What are, as a manager of a small business, what are some of the challenges you've run into, say from city officials or from banks and lenders to do the work that you're doing?
Especially in the communities that we're working and with the owners that we're working. There really is a strong resource equity gap, and in particular, as I mentioned before, around this redlining. So people in West Oakland have not had a lot of access to resources to start businesses or to get loans once the business is started. I was at a mixer, and there was a business owner, very successful, sustainable business. Everyone was touting him. And he had to borrow money to make payroll his first 3 years. And he finally called his dad, and his dad said, "Oh, well, I'll just get equity out of the house and give you $1 million." So these are the types of resources that we don't have access to. So I would say that's a major challenge, is we really need catalyst funds to bring us first on a level playing field. And that's where I really look to redevelopment dollars, federal dollars, state dollars that are earmarked in order to bring that equity. Second, then we need to be seen as credible business owners so that a bank will invest in us once we sort of get started, and we're exactly the same as the business owner over here in terms of, struggling business, meeting our projections, our marketplace, et cetera, all of the learning curves, but they'll get the money and not us because people don't see us as credible owners. So that's been a huge challenge. Even with the whole movement around social entrepreneurship and social enterprise, and there's invest slow money, there are investors out there looking for businesses like ours to invest in, but there's always an underwriter behind the scenes, and what they want to see is 3 years of profitability before they would even consider talking to you about investment. So those have been really major challenges for us coming in the community that we're in with a startup business.
We're winding out of time here. We've only got time for maybe one last question, and another one from the audience is, obviously the work to get food to families is fantastic, but what also about work to get food to the homeless populations? And how do you reach folks who maybe are entirely sort of off the rolls and don't have any support?
Food banks are part of a larger network of food distribution, and most people are unaware that the role of a food bank in a community is to set up an infrastructure to get food to people in need. And the way that food banks do that is not ordinarily primarily by handing a bag of food directly to individuals, but it is by supplying those other nonprofit organizations in the community that also provide food. And that would include pantries, it would include other types of senior or child programs, and it would include soup kitchens and those other organizations that are serving homeless people.
But even though homeless people are sort of what we have in our mind's image when we think about food banks and emergency food, that's not who's getting most of the emergency food these days. If you look at the SNAP rolls again, they've doubled in the last 5 years during the recession. it's middle-class people as well who have lost their homes, lost their jobs, and are suddenly find themselves on the other side of the transaction that goes on at a food pantry. Those are the people whom we've got to find jobs for and got to find a good safety net for, which includes the SNAP program.
And that gets back, I think, to what Sue was saying earlier. I mean, it's really a perfect storm right now of increasing demand due to the recession and families really being at the brink of bankruptcy or disaster, and at the same time, some donor fatigue as donors themselves perhaps are seeing a hit in their income, and then of course the austerity at the federal level.
Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to share a little story. We did some focus groups about 2 years ago, year and a half ago, and we talked to several homeless people and people living in transitional housing. And one of their complaints was, there's no place where I can get an apple in this community. And this was just before we were opening Mandela Foods, and we said, well, now there is. So, again, bucking that stereotype that, everyone really does want healthy, fresh food.
Well, keep up the really important work and really impressive work that you all are doing. Many thanks to Dana Harvey, Ken Hecht, and Sue Siegler. We also want to thank our audiences here in the Commonwealth Club offices on radio and on television. I'm Jason Mark, and now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club, the place where you're in the know, is adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thank
you guys. Thank you, Dana.